He's sucking here.
So
He's just a
Minoritarianism is the idea that power lies in the hands of minorities. Central to this idea is an understanding of how language is utilized by minorities to control majorities. We can think of the internet like a language. The internet pretends to have no inherent purpose or meaning. It presents itself as a system of tools for communication of ideas. However, like all languages, it contains inherent biases and teleologies. As we use the internet, we are further and further captured by its logic, by its ideology, by its philosophy, by its worldview or Weltanschauung. The internet is a form of hyperlanguage, like a religion. The poet and philosopher Michael Aaron Kamins, in his book Clouds, develops this understanding of the internet as a spiritual revolution out of his reading of Oswald Spengler. Spengler is famous for his prediction that, like other civilizations, the West would ultimately fall. Spengler maps out this fall as a process which contains within it a period of Caesarism, when the wealthy and powerful pervert systems of republicanism or constitutionalism to consolidate power, which leads to the rise of empires, civil wars, and instability, which may result in a temporary reinvigoration of the civilization before its ultimate fall. Less often discussed is Spengler's concept of the second religiousness. For Spengler, the first religion of Rome was paganism, and the second religion was Christianity. The introduction of Christianity coincided with the rise of Julius Caesar. In America, libertarians have taken special notice of the fall of Republican constitutionalism and the rise of executive power, while the far left has astutely noted the rise of the capitalists and money class. What has been unknown up until this point is what the second religiousness of America would look like. Kamins argues that in the same way that Judaism evolved out of a monotheistic worship of urbanism, and Christianity then universalized Judaism's tribal particulars, the internet introduces much of the same structural developments on a globalized scale. We can use a food pyramid to distinguish between caloric power and the power of decision. The root cal in Latin refers to heat. Decision is what directs that heat toward purpose. In the absence of decision, heat exists in a primordial chaotic diffusion. While Americans are used to the Fahrenheit system as opposed to the Celsius system, there's a third scientific system used for measuring heat known as the Kelvin system. In the Kelvin system, absolute zero is the coldest temperature which is possible. At this temperature, there is no heat present in the system being measured. In other words, there is no molecular or atomic movement or oscillating motion. It is very difficult to attain temperatures close to 0 degrees Kelvin outside the empty vacuum of space. Even then, stray photons emanating from various stars may eventually hit this diffuse cloud of thinly spread particles and impart a small amount of energy. As Newton said, an object in motion remains in motion, while an object at rest remains at rest. The purpose of a good thermos is to provide insulation. This insulation prevents the internal contents of the thermos from being influenced by its environment. The best insulator is a vacuum, and barring a vacuum, materials which are foam-like and contain space for gases, which are closer to a vacuum than liquids or solids. We can model individuals like we model atoms. Atoms have internal divisions between the electrons and the nucleus, and further divisions between protons and neutrons. Similarly, individuals can be subdivided into organs, or into emotional states, or contradictory habits, or competing goals and ideals. In the vacuum of space, a lone atom converges toward homeostasis, homo meaning same, stasis meaning standing. The atom has no directed telos. It does not intend to go here or there. It may drift occasionally, randomly, or perhaps come into the orbit of various competing gravitational fields. First, it may drift into a solar system, then toward a large planet, and finally be drawn into the gravitational field of a moon. It is popular to think of language merely as a system of objective communication. For example, scientific language or academic language represents itself as an unbiased attempt to merely represent the truth without any goal other than the truth. This is an implicitly conservative position, a colorblind position, and therefore a popular position. When the political far left states things like silence is violence, words are violent, hate speech is violent speech, the right-wing response is to say that language is like an object, something dead, or a tool, or a technology, which can be manipulated for one purpose or another. The conservative imagines the ideal American akin to something like the Buddha, to whom thoughts can pass in and out of the mind without disturbing its inner tranquility. This conservative vision, where language is impotent and the individual is sovereign to decide whether or not to accept certain claims or assumptions, and is in fact capable of questioning everything and building a consistent position up from first principles, is an inversion of the truth. In fact, it is the individual who is impotent, who is supremely inferior and subjugated to the power of language. If we understand language as a syntax, as a system of laws and rules, then we can see that language is a superset of the more superficial term religion. Religion, too, is a system of laws and rules which subjugates the individual, which has power over the individual, which gives the individual their morality and purpose. But religion does this explicitly and consciously. We are called to follow Christ, to read Torah, to join the Ummah, to make a conscious conversion and admission of faith. In this sense, language is insidious. Language does not ask permission. Language does not offer Yahweh's covenant or agreement or social contract. Language contains all of the encoding abilities of religion, but without any of the honesty. In this way, atheists and nihilists believe that in rejecting religion, they have freed themselves from all rules, all laws, and they have become free men. This is because, as highly intellectually, spiritually, or even psychologically superficial thinkers, they believe themselves to only be ruled by what they can perceive consciously. As many in the far left, degenerate, and cultural Marxist traditions have noticed, Marx, Freud, Foucault, Chomsky, power has become invisible. We can imagine a primordial order in which the stronger of two animals is he who dominates by physical display or competition. In such a system, power is evident and manifest. What differentiates humans from other animals is language, which creates fantasies, dream worlds, and alternate realities. It can be argued that many animals besides humans have the capacity for dreaming, for imagination, for envisioning the past or future. Whether or not these arguments are true or false, it still remains the case that while animals may have some linguistic or proto-linguistic abilities, they lack mimetics. In linguistics, we can speak of morphemes and phonemes. Phonemes are basic auditory building blocks of language. They include the consonants and the vowels, the fricatives, the glottal stops, and so on. The range of sounds which the human vocal cords can produce are multifarious and complex, and could be compared to the melodic diversity of bird songs or whale calls. What differentiates human phonemes from animal singing is the human ability to assign meaning to phonemes. Once meaning is assigned to a particular phoneme or group of phonemes, this phoneme becomes a morpheme. The morpheme cat is built of two consonants and a vowel, and has a particular meaning. It can be used to form more complex words like catfish, and these words are then integrated into idioms like quick as a catfish, and these idioms are then integrated into more complex syntactic structures to form sentences, paragraphs, and treatises. There are then higher forms of syntax, which we could call cultural syntax, that simultaneously emerges from and rules over thought and language. Finally, we approach something very broad and noticeable like religion, which states do not take the Lord's name in vain. It is clear that language is mutable. Consciously and unconsciously, language drifts and evolves and changes over time. Language is not merely a representation of the world, but it is also a set of instructions for how to behave. In this way, genetics is a form of language. To what extent do we control our genetics? There do exist certain emerging technologies which promise gene therapy. Since these emerging technologies are often illegal for the majority of the population, research into gene therapy is likely isolated from the public in a black market. Given the history of the federal government, including the military, FBI, and CIA, involving themselves in the drug trade and the funding of terrorism, it would not be surprising to know that they are also engaging in the very research into gene therapy, which they also claim to regulate and make illegal. Even if we could trust the government not to involve itself in playing God or creating Frankenstein, there is a precedent among the super-rich that equal application of the law can be bent with sufficient funds. While most citizens must pay taxes, the rich have tax havens. When Mel Gibson's father was sick, he flew with him to Panama in order to obtain stem cell treatment, which is otherwise illegal in the USA. Whether or not it is the government or the super rich or a combination of both, it is possible that people are at this very moment doing serious research into the therapeutic adjustment of DNA in living humans. To what extent this is already possible and is already being implemented is unknown. What is apparent is that the average person has no access to these technologies. It could, however, be said that the field of epigenetics deals with the limited ability of humans to create better or worse expressions of existing genetic code. The choices we make do change the way our DNA is expressed. These epigenetic changes can in fact be heritable for good or worse. Exposure to carcinogens, such as those found in burnt food, smoked material, as in cigarettes or marijuana leaves, exposure to radioactive material, or exposure to highly processed materials like plastics, which mirror the structure of estrogens and thus are classed as xenoestrogens. These can all cause harmful expressions of existing genetic instructions. By avoiding certain toxins or pollutants, we can avoid these expressions. A poor diet and lifestyle can be passed on to one's descendants, and these bad decisions are compounded. Men over age 50 and women over age 30 who have children have a higher chance of conceiving children with autism, and these autistic traits are not temporary, but once manifest, become heritable. On the other hand, physical exercise can help activate certain genes that might otherwise remain dormant, such as those genes which impact muscle growth or competitive psychological mindset. In this sense, our DNA is not as rigid as was once thought. There is evidence that the diet of one's grandfather can epigenetically pass on a more robust immune system, greater levels of human growth hormone, higher testosterone levels to one's descendants. We can view the plasticity of genetics as similar to the plasticity of language. Through diet, exercise, religion, and other life choices, we might produce different expressions of our DNA. Similarly, we can express many ideas and thoughts and ideals through language. However, there is no diet or exercise plan which can turn a human into a bird or a bird into a human. There are limits to the plasticity of DNA. Similarly, there are limits to the plasticity of language. To an extent, we hold the cards which we are dealt. With money, one can buy plastic surgery or perhaps even genetic therapy, but there are diminishing returns to these investments. Perhaps we're heading toward a tipping point where our knowledge of genetics will become so sophisticated that with sufficient money we can emulate all those qualities and traits which we developed under so much blood and sweat and sacrifice over millions of years. This would be a great power indeed, and those with power are loath to share it. If such a thing were possible, it would not be distributed to the majority of the population, but hoarded by a wealthy minority. Furthermore, these technologies would increase an already growing wealth gap to the point where we could speak of a real event of speciation between those with access to genetic technologies and those left behind. Many religious-minded people are skeptical that human beings could ever wield the power to undergo a process of consciously driven evolution. I would argue that such practices have already been deployed and developed even prior to the invention of the term genetics. The denial of the ability of selection to influence the traits of human populations is a fundamentally egalitarian myth. It manifests sometimes in the Pauline doctrine of neither Greek nor Jew. At other times, it manifests in the communist Zoroastrian doctrines of Mazdakisms, which were popular in 5th century Persia and then continued to have an influence on esoteric branches of Shia Islam. More recently, the term tabula rasa, taken seriously by Rousseau, has influenced the liberal doctrine of equality before the law. Some trace liberalism to the Protestant idea that all men are equal before God. On a deeper level, we can see psychological roots of egalitarianism in the tribal family, in meritocracy, and in urbanism. In the case of the tribal family, anthropologists have noted what Marx later integrated into his theory of dialectical materialism. That is, tribal families share property like food, dwellings, and in certain non-Western cases, the sharing of sexual partners. In a meritocracy, some level of equality is necessary in order to remain competitive and prevent the degeneration of an inheritable status. Regression to the mean in a population means that without constant constraints and selection, the descendants of an elite will ultimately lose those qualities which allowed them to rise to the top. By subjecting all members of the group to the same rules and the same standards, instead of isolating and protecting the elite from competition, a group can help maintain a degree of meritocratic selection. In urbanism, the inverse of the tribal family, individuals are reduced to the level of strangers. With 50% of the world's population living in an urban environment, this fact of everyday life is assumed and goes unnoticed, like water to the fish. Even those who live in a rural environment go to schools and churches informed by urbanism, presently or historically. The backwater communities, which view their brand of Christianity as free from the corruption of the cities, fail to recognize that the entire New Testament was written by city dwellers, specifically tailoring their message to the conversion of cosmopolitan urbanites. In a small group, it is possible to judge people on their individual merits. In the chaos of urbanism, it is necessary to judge people by an abstract rule like Hammurabi's Code, which does not take into account a holistic or organic judgment of the individual, but requires that the individual be treated as one among many. The individual loses their specialness. This is why in urbanism you see the great deviation from norms. In a rural society, it is easy to be special because everyone is special and unique. In an urban agricultural society, we see the emergence of worker classes and slave classes, who are mere quantities. In order to rebel against this deprivation and return to sense of identity, we see the dyeing of hair color, the piercing of skin with metal, the branding of the body with tattoos, while raving musical orgies, the ecstatic use of drugs, and so on. This is not a new development, but follows the Egyptian fascination with fashion, plucking of hair, makeup, and makeup. The media, emanating from the cities, is biased toward itself and presents the glamour of the city and the deprivation and boredom of rural life. Rural life does have its own hidden privileges, which advantage family formation and give lifelong satisfaction. The people in the cities at least have the illusion of glamour to entertain them. The worst of all worlds is the suburb. Here we find people without the advantages of rural life and without the glamour of city life. Deprived of the traditional family community and deprived of urban energy, this is the origin. I'll just say this is the origin. This is the origin of all those self-loathing cultural movements like the goth, emo, screamo, death metal, grunge, and so on. In rural life, one may have equality as a member of a family community. In the city, one may have equality as a member of the masses. It is in the suburbs that the question of equality becomes rife with the greatest opportunity for dissatisfaction, not important enough to be loved by the community, still surrounded by strangers, but not important enough to be at the center of the universe, which is the city. The religion of Judaism was founded on the worship of a central object, Yahweh. Before that supreme object, all differences between men could be seen as various molehills before a mountain. Thus, Judaism had within it both an extreme hierarchy but also an egalitarian element. The worship of the land of Canaan is not coincidental with that region's historical urbanism. Previously, the homeland of the Phoenicians, it lay between the Babylonians, the Indo-Europeans, the Sumerians, the Iranians, the Egyptians, connected to the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Mediterranean. The land of Canaan was a port or node which connected many different cultural empires throughout the ancient world. In this sense, it was a significant crossroad of urbanism. Historically, the city of Jericho is notable as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world for over 10,000 years since the dawn of agriculture and urbanism itself. Within Canaan, Judaism placed special importance on the city of Jerusalem, and we can recount in reading the Torah that Judaism required regular pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In the ancient world, this was a form of internet, a gathering of the people, a conference and confluence of energies and ideas. Just as the printing press distributed ideas across Europe and the invention of radio and television increased the speed, the quantity, the facility, and intensity of this distribution, in the ancient world, the pilgrimage privileged the holy priest power of the city above the mundane village or rural community. The transition we are now globally undergoing, whereby the events of the internet are privileged and held to be more important than what happens in the real world, is an extension of this ancient process of Judaism and urbanism. Judaism, of course, did not invent the city, but did greatly develop the concept of monotheism, which mirrors the rise of urbanism. A polytheistic system is sensible for a nomadic people who travel seasonally or yearly and go back and forth between various holy sites which have different purposes at different times. The ancient practice by which each city had its own patron god was not confined to ancient Athens with Athena or Sparta with Apollo, but dates back much earlier, going back far enough. The animist view of the world, in which every stream has its own particular water deity and every rock is inhabited by a unique spirit, represents the life of a people who are constantly in flux. The settlement of cities gave rise to polytheism, and the development of dualism and Zoroastrianism and the cult of Akhenaten in Egypt were both precedents for the monotheism of Judaism. The all-encompassing God Yahweh, through science, can be replaced by the truth or justice or some other philosophical abstraction. Culturally, Yahweh can be replaced with the internet, which is governed more and more by large corporations like Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. These corporations, at the same time as they become larger and more powerful, enter into a feedback loop with the American government, which grants them certain privileges and monopolies, but also allows the American government to be subjugated by these corporations. And I would add here, as the ancient priests had secret knowledge of hidden languages, Odin with the runes, the Catholics with Latin, the Hebrews with, I'll just leave it at that. The MAGA corporations are run by esoteric programming languages, which call upon the internet god for favors, for blessings, and for curses. These corporations, we already read that. The concept of the internet as the Wild West was popular in the early 2000s when Google was one search engine among many. We can speak today of the deep web or dark web, depending on one's tendency to define colloquially or stringently, as those web pages, and how is that spelled? Stringently, I forgot the N. Those web pages or websites which are not accessible by a Google search, but prior to the rise of Google, we could say that a majority of the internet was part of the dark or deep web. The internet did begin as a the internet began as a militaristic and academic project prepared for the event of a nuclear disruption and eventually used to facilitate academic communication. Google's development of search algorithms, which connect disparate nodes, created new commercial and entertainment and cultural opportunities. At first, there was relatively little censorship. Unlike radio or TV, where swearing and frontal nudity is mostly prohibited, the internet allowed not simply swearing and pornography, but death threats, gore, and bestiality. The excesses of the internet created the impression that the internet was not a controlled space. We assume that since swearing, nudity, and violence are regulated on our radio and TV programs, that the government must not want us seeing and hearing these things. To see and hear them on the internet was taken as evidence that the internet was truly free. But an alternate explanation is that TV and radio are stultified, calcified, and ossified institutions. Their regulations are not a product of current thinking, but a holdover from another age of moralism. If the government attempted to remove these regulations all at once without consulting the population, there might be a moralistic backlash. Churches and political groups might feel invigorated by this development and seek to undermine or threaten the state in reaction. By creating a new medium, by making its use voluntary, by creating the illusion of private ownership, by using the smokescreen of the free market and freedom of speech, the government was able to introduce a new moral paradigm without incurring the risk of creating excess reactionary energies. In truth, the internet has always had the potential for regulation. We could compare the freedom of the internet to any free app or product. At first, the game is free. Once you are addicted, the developers introduce membership fees. At first, the app is advertisement free. Once a certain number of people rely on it, the developers introduce advertisements. This is the model of Google, of Twitter, of Facebook, of all freeware software. In many cases, the product being sold is your personal information, which can be utilized to tailor better ads to best psychologically manipulate you into buying products. Now that society is completely and totally controlled and beholden and dependent on the internet, it is no longer ad-free, unregulated, independent, and so on. Yet in the same way that the regulation of TV or radio does not continuously ignite the passions of those libertarians who pine after freedom of speech, the boiling of the collective frog of internet users has produced a mostly muted response to the takeover of the internet by new regulatory powers. Sometimes these issues are brought up in reference to partisan elections. Democrats fear that Mark Zuckerberg and his Russian hackers have manipulated our democracy to elect Donald Trump. Republicans feel that Mark Zuckerberg and his Indian coders have censored conservatives. This back and forth dispute will not fade into the shadows, but become a more and more controversial topic in mainstream politics. But ultimately, it will be a diversion away from the censorship of ideas which truly threaten the system. In this way, the internet, rather than representing a threat to the system, is similar to the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire. It certainly was revolutionary in some senses, but ultimately served to prolong the lifespan of the empire by several centuries, and of course even survived its collapse. Like Christianity, the internet will be adopted by the power structure and be used to maintain control, and will even survive the collapse of America. Control over the internet and the global corporations which write its algorithms will determine the future of the West and what is to come. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.